So we're going to continue to talk about roundworms, which I'm sure some of you are going, why the heck are we learning about all these worms? And, you know, it's college for you. You're going to get a lot of exposure to things that the people up here are very fascinated with, that they think are interesting. I think this stuff is interesting. And so I'm going to tell you these stories about it. And they do affect health around the world, even though the last thing was really, it just affects health because the doctors have this, you know. Next time you see a doctor with a badge and they've got the little caduceus on the badge, you go, oh, you know, that's a worm stick. Some of them get upset at the implication that it's a worm stick. I don't know why, but they do. So we're going to continue our list of roundworms. Trichinella causes trichinosis. Trichinella is a parasite of meat eaters. So predators that catch and kill things and eat them, and scavengers that scavenge on meat. If they're mammals, furry, hairy, then they can be infected with trichinella. Classically, people get exposed to trichinella through eating pork. Is it, let me make sure that that's registering the screen right. In your classic pig farm, you know, the pigs are raised out there. They throw a lot of, you know, slop out for them. It draws a lot of scavengers, including rats. Rats, because they're scavengers, pick up trichinella. They can harbor it. I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. And, you know, if the rat's not fast enough, pigs will eat pretty much anything, including live rats. And if you've ever seen an adult hog, they are huge animals, and grabbing and eating a rat's not a big deal for them. And they will get trichinella. And then if you eat the pork without cooking it properly, then okay, I'm sorry, it's going to put this image in your head. Cooking it kills the worms. They're still in the meat, but it kills them. This is what happens. You take in contaminated meat. You digest the meat around the worms, and depending on the larval stage of the worms, they may transform into adults, and then the females will lay eggs, and the larvae will emerge from your intestine and just go through your circulation and embed themselves in your muscles. They get into the muscles, they curl up in a little space. Your immune system goes a little nuts, but they're way too big for your immune system to do anything about. The closest your immune system can come to controlling them is it walls them off. Because they curl up and they don't move, unlike most of the other worms we talk about that will migrate around and you don't get a chance to do this, we will actually seal these guys up in a little nodule of calcium. Doesn't bother them, they're just waiting for you to get eaten by the next meat eater. But it was actually discovered way back when by a butcher who realized that it felt different. His really, really sharp knives, it felt and almost sounded different when he cut pork as opposed to cutting beef or mutton. And he had a microscope and he took, you know, very thin slices of meat and looked at them under his little, you know, microscope and saw little white dots in the meat. And if he cracked the dots, little worms came out. That's how they discovered trichinella. Now, we don't tend to get a lot of our pork from regular family farms anymore. It comes from what are called factory farms, which is, you don't want to read about those. They're kind of nasty. You know, the pigs are sealed up in these big buildings and they have very little room to move around. But there's a lot of control and not, you know, they don't get exposed to rats. They don't get exposed to trichinella. So it was decided a few years ago that trichinella was not really a U.S. problem anymore. And instead of cooking the meat to when it's white, which is what you used to do with pork, that definitely killed the worms, they now are allowing the cooking of pork to like 160 degrees, something like that, pink. I've mentioned this before. You may not be getting trichinella. If you're getting a farm pig, who knows whether you're getting trichinella or not. Because, you know, oh, we get this pork locally, I would worry about that. But Toxoplasma, the protozoan parasite that I talked about earlier, is not killed unless you cook the meat to white either. So there's a bunch of reasons you don't want rare pork, even though they're technically allowed to serve it now. you're better off not getting rare pork. Bear, possum, raccoon, a lot of wild animals that are either predators or scavengers that people hunt can also be contaminated with trichinella. So you gotta be careful if you're into, game, wild game. Not gonna have it from deer, but you could have it from a bear. Keep that in mind. Not a lot of fun to have these things, burrowing up in your muscles. Pinworms, by far the most common roundworm infection in the United States. Nobody knows for sure how common it is. I've seen a low level around 20%, which is 1 in every 5 people in the United States. I've seen an upper range, it's 75%, which is 3 out of every 4 people in the United States. It's probably somewhere in between. More common in upper class people than lower class people. Nobody really knows why. Maybe competition with other parasites. And it may not be a parasite. It doesn't appear to be taking something from us that we would otherwise use. It appears to be living on things that live in us that are, our microbiome, the bacteria that live in your colon, because these guys live in your colon, your large intestine. By the time your food gets to your colon, you've taken most of the food out of it. You've taken most of the nutrients out of it. Your colon is primarily where we get a few things out, and mostly the water. And it is full of bacteria that do all sorts of things for us. We talked about that earlier when we talked about bacteria. Pinworms live, okay, let me back up. So you got your stomach here. It goes into your small intestine. Your small intestine has a big squiggle here, and the end of it goes here. This is your colon. Your colon starts a little bit above where your intestine really hits it. Get into the light here. And this is the area that pinworms tend to live in. This is also where your appendix attaches to your colon. And then your colon goes up and across and down and then squiggles from there towards your backside. So it's a long way out for these tiny, tiny pinworms. They're small enough that if you have really, really good eyesight, you could see them, but they're not very big. And you can get a decent sized population. It doesn't seem to bother people. There's some question as to whether there may be a connection between pinworms wandering in and out of your appendix and carrying the wrong bacteria and giving you appendicitis, but nobody really knows for sure. But this is what they do. When the females are ready to lay eggs, they want to be outside of your body when they lay the eggs, so they have to migrate. Now it's like 4 or 5 feet for them to migrate for a really tiny worm. So it takes them a while. Sometimes they don't make it. They hit a point, gotta lay my eggs. They lay the eggs somewhere in your colon and the larvae hatch out and go back up to where everybody's having their party. But what they typically do is they get to the exit, which is a muscle, a sphincter muscle, a valve. And they kind of hold off until everything's quiet and the valve is a little bit relaxed, which typically is very early in the morning after you've been sleeping for a long time. And she's tiny, so she can kind of get out. She gets out, and what she does is she crawls across the surface of the skin, leaving a trail, a kind of a wet trail of eggs. They're not really stuck there. They're stuck there for a while until it dries out. And these eggs are really tiny. They go flying off, just as dust. They're so small that a regular vacuum cleaner with a bag, they'll go through the bag and back out into the air. You go into the vacuum cleaner, through the bag, and back out in the air. So you can actually spread them vacuuming. They also can spread through clothing. So, you've got these eggs on you and you sit down real heavily, poof, is that you can leave the eggs. They wind up kind of everywhere. If you look this up, you will see that pinworms are considered a childhood disease. They are not. They can live in anybody of any age, and they are just as common in adults as they are in children, if not more so. The reason they're considered a childhood disease is because children are the ones that tend to have noticeable symptoms. What do I mean by noticeable? Okay, lady worm is out crawling across on your skin early in the morning, and she may make your skin itchy. If you're a little kid, your nerves are closer together. You have all the nerves that you had as a little kid, but now they're farther apart because you're bigger. So you're a little bit more sensitive to this, but more importantly, if you're in kindergarten or you're in daycare, your mom drops you off, you're walking around, your butt itches, you're gonna scratch it. You're walking around digging at your butt. That makes it a noticeable symptom. Now, we as adults, maybe early in the morning our butt itches, but if we're in the presence of other people, we're not digging at our butts typically. And we don't even necessarily even think about that as much of a symptom, but we can have them as well. But the kids, the daycare teacher notices, and they know about this thing. They say, you may want to have your kid check for pinworms. And the parent goes, what do you mean? Well, you'll do the Scotch tape test. When your kid wakes up in the morning, you flip them over, pull down their PJs, take a piece of Scotch tape, and stick it on and off the skin around their butthole. Stick, 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 stick. Take it to the doctor. They look at it under a microscope, and we'll see eggs, maybe the females, if there's pinworms there. And then they'll treat them. They'll treat everybody in the family. Because if the kid's got it, everybody in the family's got it. So why are they so common? They're everywhere, right? As if somewhere around 50% of people in the United States are passing these eggs. Pretty much everywhere you go, you have the potential for picking the eggs up. And if we treat it, they make the worms go away that are in you that day, but there's a real good chance, somewhere in the next month you're going to pick them up again. Fortunately, they're pretty benign. There's not a lot of evidence they're doing anything bad. They're probably no more nasty to us than those bacteria they're eating from our colon. But, people get a little upset when they say, oh, we got these worms in us. Well, yeah, you do. They may find out that they're like your microbiome, they may be helping your immune system in some way. I should mention, and you'll get a handout about this when we talk about the immune system, there is some evidence that because we are not exposed to parasites in the United States, in a lot of Western countries, early in our lives, our immune systems are kind of primed to learn by exposure. And if you don't get exposed to things like worms and such when you're young, your immune system starts to look for other things to react to. And so allergies tend to be, as parasite levels get under control, allergy levels tend to rise. And so some people have said, well, why don't we expose people to parasites and maybe we can kind of boot their, I just kicked, we'll boot their immune system into working properly. And there was some studies a number of years ago giving people what are called whipworms, which are intestinal worms, but they weren't human whipworms. So they would live in somebody for a while, try to reproduce and not be terribly successful and eventually die. But your immune system would get exposed to them. And they thought that might help people who had either bad allergies or diseases where their immune system was attacking their own tissues. Why am I talking about this? Because some people who didn't understand what was going on offshore, you can buy roundworms to do this. If you have an autoimmune disease and you go digging hard enough on the internet, you'll find people who go, we can sell you roundworms and the roundworms will help your condition, except they're not whipworms, they're hookworms. And so they are potentially a very dangerous thing to expose yourself to. So if you know anybody who goes, oh, I'm gonna get this worm treatment for my MS or my Addison's disease or whatever you got, there's a whole bunch of autoimmune diseases. I'd tell them, no, do not do that. It's also illegal to have these things shipped in, but, and who knows, pinworms might be helping us that way. There's one whole group of roundworms called filarial worms. Now these guys tend to be carried by biting insects to get from one host to the next. Different biting insects in different parts of the world. Some of them are very nasty. There's a filarial worm that produces something called river blindness. The river is because it's connected to a biting insect whose larvae live in slow-flowing water. So not streams, not lakes, rivers. So if you live near a river, you're gonna get exposed to these biting insects. If you don't live near a river, you don't have river blindness. But the worms get picked up by one host and then carried to next host that gets bitten. And the larvae will, because they're big and your immune system can't do much about them, can live in you for years and years and years and cause damage all over the place. And for some reason, they like to crawl through people's eyeballs and will eventually damage the eyeballs to the point where if you got them as kids, by the time you're in your 30s or 40s, you can't really see. And so that's where the blindness comes from. So in some parts of Africa, this is a horrendous impact disease. Talked about the World Health Organization. This is on their hit list because it's not deadly, but it has a huge economic impact. If a huge fraction of your adult population is blind, there's not a lot of economy that you're going to have. Now, we do have filarial worms around here, but our filarial worm only affects people in their wallets because it is not a human filarial worm. It is a dog filarial worm. So this includes heartworms. Heartworms are picked up and passed by mosquitoes. They pick them up from one dog, and then they go into the next dog that the mosquito bites. And again, weird worms is that they take up residence in the flow-through parts of your heart and the outflow of your heart. Which if you're gonna, it's like living in a stream and deciding to live in the rapids, which I guess some fish do, so, it happens other places too. The outflow can, very often if you get a heavy infection, they get pushed loose and they get into your lungs. Your outflow for the right side of your heart goes to your lungs. And they can jam up your lungs. Over time, your heart pushes blood into your lungs, the jam pushes the blood back, the heart has trouble pumping, it expands, it gets enlarged, the valves don't fit properly. It can be a very dangerous long-term disease that dogs can get. The pills that you get for them will kill the worms, but they gotta check first, because if the dog has a bunch of heartworms and you kill them all of a sudden, that's really going to jam up the blood flow into the lungs, so it can be really dangerous. You have to kind of ease them into treatment for it. And they're not real expensive to treat, but you got to keep treating them, every month. The heartworms don't live in people. There's like one recorded case of heartworms living in people. They will live in coyotes. They will live in foxes. So even if we got all the dogs treated, there would be what they call reservoir hosts, wild hosts, that would still carry them and possibly expose your dogs to them. Heartworms, not crazy about living in cats. There are more cases in cats than are in people, but they don't tend to live in cats. And that's the roundworms. And we're almost done with the living things that can make us sick.